The millionaire's son, a child with Down syndrome, hadn't eaten for days. The silence in the house weighed as heavily as the absence of smiles. No doctor, therapist, or medicine could help him until a new nanny, simple and poor, arrived with no promises, just with an unexpected gesture that changed everything. What she did in that kitchen made the impossible happen and left the millionaire father completely speechless. The Blackwood estate was a monument to silence. From the outside, the perfectly sculpted gardens and the imposing facade promised a life of luxury and fulfillment. But inside, the air was thin, as heavy as a mausoleum's. Arthur Blackwood, a man whose fortune in hedge funds and real estate ventures grew with every passing second, moved through the corridors like a ghost in his own house. Ever since his wife, Eleanor, had gone, the color had drained from his world, leaving only the gray tones of grief and duty. His heart, once an engine of passion and ambition, now beat with the cold precision of a Swiss watch, marking the empty hours. He understood cash flow, ROIs, and how to turn capital into more capital. But his own son's smile was a treasure he no longer knew how to find. Little Leo, age 7, was the epicenter of that silence. With his almond-shaped eyes that once shone with the pure joy of childhood, he now stared at the world with an apathy that would break anyone's heart. Seated at the polished dining table, before an untouched plate, he was the personification of the pain the house tried to hide. Down syndrome gave him a heightened sensitivity, and his mother's absence had wounded him in a place no doctor could reach. He hadn't eaten in days. Not really. He would only pick at his food, pushing it from one side of the plate to the other, as if the very act of nourishing himself was a betrayal of her memory. Renowned therapists, nutritionists, and a succession of caregivers had tried, but they had all failed to breach the invisible wall the boy had built around himself. That morning, however, something different broke the calculated routine of the estate. Helena arrived. She didn't bring framed diplomas or a list of references from wealthy families. She carried only a simple canvas tote bag, a pair of worn shoes, and a gaze that seemed to hold the quiet wisdom of someone who had known pain and overcome it. Her voice, as she introduced herself at the door, was serene, almost a whisper, yet firm. She was received by Beatrice, the housekeeper, a woman who had served the family for decades and who clung to order and discipline like a life raft. Beatrice sized her up, the disdain clear on her face. "Mr. Blackwood demands punctuality and efficiency. The boy needs routine, not sentimentality," she said, her voice sharp. Helena simply nodded, a soft smile on her lips. When Beatrice led her to the kitchen, the housekeeper's contempt became palpable. "She won't last a week," she muttered to the cook, certain the new nanny wouldn't overhear, but Helena heard, and she was unshaken. Her eyes found the small figure sitting at the table, the breakfast plate untouched. The world seemed to fall away. She didn't see a medical condition or a problem to be solved. She saw a boy with a broken heart. Ignoring Beatrice's hostile presence, Helena approached slowly, pulled out a chair, and sat beside Leo without saying a single word. She didn't try to coax him to eat, she just sat there, sharing his silence. Then, from her bag, she took out a small, hand-painted wooden bird and placed it gently on the table. Leo, for the first time that morning, shifted his gaze. His small hand reached out, hesitant, and his fingers touched the smooth wing of the toy. From a distance, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, Arthur watched, his heart tight in his chest. He saw the silent interaction, the absence of pressure, the simple, gentle presence. For the first time in months, a spark of something he didn't dare name as hope struck him. But beside him, Beatrice observed the same scene with a grim look. Her lips pursed into a thin line of disapproval. She turned to Arthur, and her voice, poisoned with false concern, whispered, "Sir, This woman is too simple. She will destroy the discipline we have worked so hard to impose. This is a mistake. Helena's first day was a silent battle against the estate's rigidity. Beatrice presented her with a laminated schedule with time slots that governed Leo's life in 15-minute intervals: 8 a.m., breakfast, attempt, 8:15 a.m., speech therapy exercises, videos, 8:30 a.m., cognitive stimulation, tablet apps. The list stretched until nightfall, a schedule that seemed more suited for a high-powered executive than a grieving child. Helena looked at the sheet, then at Leo's small figure curled up on the living room sofa, and knew that the paper was a representation of everything that was wrong there. Arthur's net worth was vast, but the house was in complete emotional bankruptcy. With a respectful nod, she folded the schedule and put it in her pocket. "I'm going to follow his time, Mrs. Beatrice," she said with her usual calm, which made the housekeeper's eyes narrow into slits of pure irritation. Instead of turning on the tablet, Helena opened the glass doors leading to the garden. The fresh morning air flooded the stagnant room. Leo didn't move, but his eyes followed the nanny as she went outside and sat on the grass, near a bed of roses that the late Eleanor had loved so much. Helena didn't call him. She just sat there, feeling the sun on her face, watching a ladybug crawl up a leaf. Long minutes passed. From his office window, Arthur watched her, a mixture of skepticism and curiosity churning in his gut. He had built his fortune on logic, discipline, and control. What this woman was doing was the opposite of everything he believed in. It was a waste of time, an investment with no return. Yet he couldn't look away. Beatrice's patience, however, was far less elastic. She marched into the garden, hands on her hips, her voice like a whip. "What do you think you're doing? This is negligence. The boy should be at his therapies." Helena turned, the sun illuminating her serene face. "He is in therapy, Mrs. Beatrice. He's learning how to breathe again. We both are." The response disarmed the housekeeper for a moment, but the anger soon returned, stronger. "I will inform Mr. Blackwood of your insubordination," she hissed, before turning on her heel and marching back into the house. Helena sighed, not out of fear, but sadness. She knew the housekeeper wasn't an evil woman, just someone who, like Arthur, had forgotten how to feel. It was then that a small movement caught her attention. Leo was standing at the glass door, watching her. There was a conflict in his eyes, the fear of leaving, of breaking the safety of his cocoon, and the desire to approach that island of calm in the middle of his ocean of pain. Helena smiled at him, a genuine smile, with no expectations. And then she began to hum, a simple melody, a lullaby her grandmother used to sing to her. Helena's voice wasn't trained, but it was filled with a tenderness that floated on the air like the scent of roses. Slowly, step by step, Leo came out into the garden. He didn't go to her. He sat a safe distance away, hugging his knees, but his eyes never left the nanny's face. He was listening. Arthur, from the window, felt a lump form in his throat. It was the first time he had seen his son venture outside willingly in months. Later, as the sun was setting, Arthur found her in the kitchen, preparing a simple vegetable broth whose aroma filled the house with a long-forgotten sense of home. "My housekeeper believes you are not following protocol," he said, his voice formal, distant. "What is your method exactly?" Helena turned, drying her hands on a cloth. "I don't have a method, Mr. Blackwood. I have a heart. Your son doesn't need a protocol. He needs a connection." The simplicity of the answer struck him. Connection. A word he used in his business dealings, in his networks, but which had become foreign within his own home. He was about to argue, to speak of the importance of specialists, when Beatrice entered the kitchen, her face a mask of dark triumph. In her hands, she held a pair of Leo's shoes, completely caked in mud. "Sir," she said, her voice laden with false concern, I found the boy alone in the garden, near the pond. The nanny was nowhere to be seen. He could have drowned. The air in the kitchen grew thick and heavy. Beatrice's accusation hung between them, venomous and deliberate. Arthur Blackwood, a man accustomed to making decisions that moved millions of dollars in seconds, felt paralyzed. His gaze shifted between Beatrice's face, contorted with feigned worry, and Helena's unnerving calm. Arthur's mind, trained to analyze assets and liabilities, to calculate the risk of every investment, was now faced with an equation that involved no numbers. On one side, Beatrice's loyalty, a pillar of order in his chaotic life, a constant amid his pain. On the other, a spark of something he barely dared to name, an emotion Helena seemed to awaken in his son and dangerously in himself. He looked at the muddy shoes, the proof of the crime, and felt the weight of his own failure as a father. He had an incalculable fortune, a net worth that spanned continents, but he couldn't guarantee the safety or happiness of his only heir. "Explain yourself," he said, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. It was the tone he used in his board meetings, the tone of one who demands results and tolerates no failure. Beatrice took a step back, an almost imperceptible smile of satisfaction on her lips. She expected Helena to stammer, to apologize, to fall apart. But Helena simply placed the dishcloth on the counter and met Arthur's eyes, unwavering. "It's true, Mr. Blackwood. We were at the pond." The direct confession made Beatrice stand taller, ready for the final blow. But the boy was not in danger. Helena continued, her voice firm and gentle. "He wasn't alone. I was with him the entire time, kneeling beside him at the water's edge." She paused, letting her words settle. "While we were in the garden, I noticed Leo kept looking towards the pond. It wasn't the water that drew him, but the little black dots moving in it. They were tadpoles." He was curious. "So, I took him to see them up close. The mud on his shoes is because we knelt together in the damp earth to watch the life being born there." He was fascinated. Helena looked past Arthur, toward the hallway. "He even found a treasure, didn't you, sweetie?" At that moment, as if guided by an invisible force, Leo appeared in the kitchen doorway. He didn't look scared or shaken. In his small hand, he carefully held a smooth, dark stone, polished by the water. His eyes were not on his father or on Beatrice, but on Helena, and in them was a silent, absolute trust. That image was more powerful than any argument. The stone in Leo's hand was irrefutable proof, not of negligence, but of an afternoon of discovery. Arthur felt the lump in his throat tighten even more. Beatrice saw danger and disorder. Helena saw curiosity and life. He, the billionaire who understood the value of gold and cryptocurrency, felt like a complete fool about the value of a moment like this one. Beatrice's rigidity, which had once seemed like a fortress, now revealed itself as a prison. He turned to the housekeeper, the ice in his voice unmistakable. "I appreciate your concern, Beatrice, but you are dismissed for the day. Ms. Helena has the situation under control." Beatrice's face transformed, shifting from anticipated victory to sheer disbelief, and then to a restrained fury. She shot Helena a look that promised retaliation before withdrawing, her hard footsteps echoing in the silence. Arthur then turned back to Helena, skepticism still warred with hope inside him. One successful afternoon wasn't enough. He needed concrete proof, a result he could measure. "It's one thing to watch tadpoles, Ms. Helena. It's another thing entirely to nourish my son." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Tomorrow, at lunch, I want to see a result. I want to see my son eat, not pick, not play. Eat. If he doesn't eat, your experiment in this house will have come to an end." The next morning dawned under the weight of the ultimatum. The estate seemed to hold its breath, an expectant silence that was louder than any sound. Beatrice moved with a smug efficiency, polishing surfaces that already gleamed, her eyes darting furtive, victorious glances in Helena's direction. She was certain the nanny would fail. Discipline and order would be restored. And this intruder, with her absurd ideas about feelings and tadpoles, would be just a passing memory. Arthur locked himself in his office, pretending to focus on performance charts for his investment funds and the fluctuating price of gold. But his eyes didn't see the numbers. They saw only his son's face, pale and listless, and the challenge he himself had laid down. The man who negotiated the future of multi-million-dollar corporations, whose net worth was the envy of the business world, felt powerless, betting his last spark of hope on the most unlikely woman. Helena, however, showed no sign of feeling the pressure. She spent the morning with Leo in his room, not with apps or flashcards, but with a box of crayons and blank sheets of paper. They sat on the floor, side by side, and drew. Helena drew smiling suns and trees with branches that looked like open arms. Leo, at first, just held a blue crayon, unmoving, but gradually, seeing the freedom with which Helena created her colorful world, he began to make timid marks on the paper. It wasn't a work of art, but it was a start. It was communication. When lunchtime approached, the tension in the house reached its peak. Beatrice announced the meal with the solemnity of an executioner, but Helena didn't take Leo to the immense, cold dining room. Instead, she served a small plate at the kitchen table, a warmer, more welcoming space. On the plate was a simple culinary masterpiece, mashed potatoes as fluffy as a cloud, a bit of carrot puree forming a vibrant sun, and small pieces of shredded chicken. Beatrice watched from the doorway, arms crossed, her face like stone. Leo sat down, looked at the plate, and his face shut down. The old barrier went back up. He pushed the plate away. Helena didn't insist. She picked up a fork, speared a tiny piece of chicken, and said in an animated voice, "Attention, control tower, Flight 07 is ready for takeoff." She made the fork fly through the air, complete with engine sound effects. "Neo, the plane needs to land somewhere safe. I wonder if Hangar Leo is open." She brought the fork close to the boy's mouth. He turned his head away. The hope in Arthur's office, who was peeking through a crack in the door, withered. Beatrice allowed herself a satisfied smile. Helena didn't lose heart. "Oh no! The hangar is closed. Emergency route. Let's try to land on the sun." She dipped the airplane into the carrot puree. "Now it's a golden plane, a magic plane. It flies even higher." She made the fork do pirouettes in the air, the narrative becoming more elaborate and fun. Leo watched her, his once empty eyes now shining with a spark of curiosity. He followed the fork's flight with his head. Then a tiny, almost inaudible sound escaped his lips. A muffled giggle in his office. Arthur froze. Did he hear that? Was it real? He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs, a wild rhythm he hadn't felt in years. He followed the sound, each step a mixture of terror and hope. When he reached the kitchen door, he saw the impossible scene. Helena was flying the chicken and carrot airplane toward Leo's mouth. And Leo, his mouth open, not out of obligation, but with the joy of the game, received the plane. And he laughed, a real laugh, clear and crystalline, that echoed through the kitchen and broke the spell of silence in that house. Arthur stood paralyzed in the doorway, tears welling in his eyes without his realizing it. His son was laughing and eating. The joy was so overwhelming it hurt. In that instant, Beatrice, outraged by the scene she considered a circus, stepped forward, her voice as sharp as broken glass. "What is all this mess? That's enough. Food is not a toy." She reached out to take the plate, to end the joy, to restore her order. And from the hallway, a thick, raw voice, which he barely recognized as his own, rang out with an authority that made both women freeze. "Don't you dare touch that plate." Arthur's voice cut through the air like thunder, laden with a raw emotion he rarely showed. Beatrice froze, her hand inches from the plate, her face a mask of shock and humiliation. She turned slowly, expecting to meet the cold, disapproving gaze of her employer, but what she saw completely disarmed her. Arthur Blackwood, the ruthless magnate, the man whose empire of assets was legendary, was standing in the kitchen doorway with red, tear-filled eyes. A single tear traced a slow path down his face, a river breaking the stone dam of his self-control. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on Leo, who, oblivious to the tension, was clapping his hands, waiting for the food airplane to take off again. "Leave," Arthur said, his voice low but vibrating with an unquestionable intensity. He wasn't addressing Helena. His eyes were locked on Beatrice. For a moment, the housekeeper seemed not to understand. She opened her mouth to argue, to defend her years of loyal service, to point out the absurdity of the scene. But Arthur's gaze silenced her. It was the look of a man who had just had his world turned upside down and would not tolerate any more interference. Without a word, Beatrice turned and left, her defeat as palpable as the joy that now filled the room. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty, but full. Helena, with her characteristic sensitivity, sensed the fragility of the moment. She knew Arthur's presence, with all its authority and contained pain. They could break the spell. With a soft smile for Leo, she said, "I think our plane needs more fuel," and he, with a natural movement, dipped the fork back into the plate, continuing the game as if nothing had happened. Arthur remained in the doorway, watching, feeling like an intruder in his own home, a spectator to the intimate connection forming before his eyes. He, who bought and sold shares in giant corporations, realized that the greatest dividend he could ever receive was being paid out right then, in his kitchen, in the form of his son's laughter. That night, the routine was broken in an even more profound way. After Helena had put Leo to bed, not with the rigidity of a schedule, but after a story about a wooden bird that learned to fly, she found him in the library. Arthur wasn't working. He was standing before a large portrait of Eleanor, his late wife, an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand. "Thank you," he said, without turning around, "for what you did today." Helena approached, keeping a respectful distance. "I didn't do anything, Mr. Blackwood. Leo did. He just needed permission to be a child again." Arthur finally turned to her, his eyes dark. "I don't know how to do this. I know how to build a business from scratch. I know how to turn 1,000 into $1 million. But I don't know how to reach my own son." The confession hung in the air, an act of vulnerability so rare it seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. "You don't have to reach for him," Helena replied, her voice a balm. "You just need to sit on the floor with him." The simplicity of the advice both irritated and drew him in. It was easy for her to say. She didn't carry the weight of his loss, the guilt of not having been more present. He was about to shut down again, to raise his walls, when he noticed something on the small table beside Helena. It was the piece of paper Leo had scribbled on earlier. He picked it up. They were just blue lines, shapeless. But then Helena came closer and pointed to the center of the tangle. "Look," she said. He drew 3 figures. Arthur squinted, and suddenly he saw it. They weren't just scribbles. They were 3 clumsy but unmistakable stick figures, holding hands, a big one, a little one, and a figure in a dress in the middle. He looked at Helena, a question in his eyes. She smiled, a sad, tender smile. I asked him who they were. He pointed to the figures. "Daddy, Leo, Mommy." The air left Arthur's lungs with a punch. He stared at the drawing, at the raw, childlike representation of the family he had lost, and felt the pain of Eleanor's absence like a fresh knife in his chest. But alongside the pain, there was something else, something new, a pang of warmth. Seeing Helena smile at the drawing, he felt a slight tremor, an unexpected tenderness that frightened and unnerved him deeply. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very, very long time. And at that instant, a distant relative of Eleanor's, A great-aunt named Elvira, a woman known for her sharp tongue and her adherence to tradition, was standing in the library doorway, observing the scene with hawk-like eyes, her face twisting into a mask of disapproval. Elvira's presence in the library doorway was like a blast of frigid air, extinguishing the fragile flame of warmth that had just been born. She was the personification of Arthur's old world, a world of appearances, tradition, and veiled judgments. Dressed in a pearl-grey silk suit that seemed as rigid as her posture, she advanced into the room, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. Her small, penetrating eyes ignored Arthur and landed on Helena with a cold, immediate appraisal, cataloguing her simple clothes, her working hands, and her audacity to be there, in this sanctuary. "Arthur, darling," she said, her voice a sweet syrup with a bitter aftertaste, "I came for a surprise visit, but I see you're occupied." Arthur's moment of vulnerability shattered. He straightened up, the whiskey glass suddenly heavy in his hand, the warmth in his chest turning to ice. The businessman, the billionaire who commanded boardrooms, retook control. "Aunt Elvira, what a surprise! This is Helena, Leo's new caregiver." The word caregiver was said with a formality that hadn't existed seconds before. It was a demarcation of territory, a reminder of everyone's place. Elvira arched a perfectly drawn eyebrow. "Ah, the caregiver," she repeated. The tone insinuating the title was inadequate for the scene she had just witnessed. Her gaze fell on the drawing Arthur was still holding. How intimate, in Eleanor's library, of all rooms. Each word was a needle, aimed precisely at Arthur's guilt and pride. "People talk, Arthur. A man in your position, with your wealth, needs to be careful. Letting a simple woman gain so much influence over the house, over your son, it isn't proper. Think of what Eleanor would say. Think of the family's reputation, our legacy." Elvira's words were poison, and Arthur drank it down. The gratitude he felt for Helena began to mix with an ugly, corrosive feeling, shame. Shame for his own emotion, for his need, for being seen in a moment of weakness by an employee. His world was made of logic, of contracts, of a calculated distance. What Helena offered was something that couldn't be quantified, couldn't be listed as an asset, and that terrified him. The fear of judgment, a fear he thought he had conquered with his fortune, returned with full force. Helena felt the shift in the air. The connection was broken. Arthur's gaze, once open and confused, was now veiled, distant. She saw the millionaire's mask settle back onto his face. With quiet dignity, she took a step back. "Excuse me, Mr. Blackwood, Ma'am. I should check on Leo." She didn't wait for a reply, simply excused herself from the room, the warmth in her face replaced by a cool pallor. As she passed Elvira, she felt the woman's triumphant gaze on her back. Arthur didn't stop her. He let her go. He felt like a coward. But Elvira's voice continued to echo in his mind. "It isn't proper." His son's laughter, the light in his eyes, all of it was suddenly overshadowed by the weight of social expectations. The next morning, the change was undeniable. The estate was cold again. Arthur passed Helena in the hallway and treated her with an icy politeness that was worse than any shouting. "Miss Helena," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Effective today, Mrs. Beatrice will resume full supervision of the household routines. Your activities are to be reported directly to her." He paused, the final blow delivered with the chill of a business transaction. "And please, restrict your interactions with Leo to the activities on the schedule. We need to restore discipline." The days that followed were a silent torture. Arthur's order, driven by Elvira's venomous words, descended on the house like a frost, freezing the warmth that had barely begun to sprout. Helena found herself chained to Beatrice's schedule, a list of cold, impersonal tasks that kept her busy, but miles away from Leo's heart. She took him to the speech therapy sessions on the tablet, supervised the educational games, but the magic was broken. Leo felt the distance, his father's inexplicable coldness, and the absence of Helena's easy laughter. He retreated into himself again, eating the bare minimum, his large, expressive eyes now clouded with confusion and sadness. Arthur, for his part, threw himself into work with a desperate ferocity, using his business and the management of his vast assets as a shield against his own feelings. He had built his fortune on the premise of control, and now, having lost control of his emotions, he clung to what he knew, accumulating money and power, ignoring the bankruptcy consuming his home. Beatrice, restored to her authority, patrolled the halls with an air of triumph. For her, order had been restored. The nanny was in her place, and cheap sentimentality had been eradicated. However, she saw the signs of Leo's regression, saw the shadow return to the boy's eyes, and it infuriated her. In her twisted mind, it was Helena's fault for having given the boy a taste of undisciplined freedom and now leaving him to suffer with the inevitable return to reality. She needed to prove, once and for all, that Helena was a danger, a harmful influence that needed to be permanently removed. The perfect opportunity arose on a rainy afternoon, when the garden was out of the question and Helena was trying, unsuccessfully, to engage Leo with building blocks in the living room. Beatrice went up to Eleanor's old room, a sanctuary Arthur kept untouched. On a mahogany vanity, there was a heavy, ornate silver picture frame holding a smiling photo of his late wife, her heart beating fast, not with guilt but with cold determination. Beatrice took the object. She descended the stairs silently. In the living room, she saw Helena get up to fetch Leo a glass of juice from the kitchen. It was the chance she'd been waiting for. She approached the boy and, in a falsely sweet voice, said, "Look, Leo, a shiny puzzle." With a quick, deliberate motion, she dropped the picture frame on the floor. The glass shattered, scattering glittering shards across the Persian rug. "Pick up the little stars for Auntie Beatrice," she whispered, before backing away into the shadows of the hall to watch her trap spring. Leo, drawn by the sparkle, crawled towards the shards. His small hand, moved by innocent curiosity, reached for one of the larger pieces. At that exact moment, Helena returned from the kitchen. The sight made her drop the tray. Juice spilled across the floor, but she didn't notice. "Leo, no!" she cried, running toward him. But before she could reach him, Beatrice emerged from her hiding spot, letting out a sharp, terrified scream that echoed through the entire house. "My God! Arthur, help!" Arthur shot out of his office as if struck by lightning. He ran to the living room, and the scene he found was the materialization of his worst nightmares. His son, his vulnerable son, on the floor, his hand inches from a sharp shard of glass, the photo of his late wife, shattered, and Helena, standing there, her face pale with horror. Beatrice grabbed Arthur's arm, crocodile tears streaming down her face. "I saw everything. She left him alone with the broken glass. I swear, Arthur, she just watched him do it. She's negligent, reckless." Arthur didn't hear the details, only the verdict. Panic, pain, guilt, and Elvira's words collided within him in an atomic explosion. He looked at Helena, not seeing the nanny who had made his son laugh, but a direct threat to the only precious thing he had left. His voice trembling with rage and pain, he pointed to the door. "Get your things. Get out of my house, now." Arthur's words fell like the blade of a guillotine, severing the last thread of hope Helena still held. She tried to speak, to explain, but his face was an impenetrable wall of pain and fury. Beatrice's accusation, so absurd and cruel, had found fertile ground in his confusion and fear. For Arthur, in that moment of blind panic, it was easier to believe in the betrayal of a stranger, than to confront the complexity of his own feelings and the possibility that he had misjudged the woman who had served his family for years. Beatrice's loyalty was a known asset, a long-term investment in his life. Helena was a new and volatile variable, and his businessman's instinct screamed to cut the risk. As Helena, her heart in pieces, climbed the stairs to gather her few belongings, the house seemed to exhale a somber sigh of relief. Beatrice, the restorer of order, moved with frantic efficiency, cleaning up the shards of glass, the contrite expression on her face barely hiding the satisfaction of victory. Arthur scooped Leo into his arms, the boy's body trembling with silent sobs, not from the glass, but from his father's explosion of anger and the anguish hanging in the air. He took his son into the office, closing the door as if he could lock the chaos out, but the chaos was already inside him. Helena's departure was as quiet as her arrival. With her small tote bag over her shoulder, she came down the stairs and paused for a moment at the living room door. Leo, from Arthur's arms, saw her. Their eyes met for a brief second, and in that gaze was a universe of questions and a sadness so deep it took Helena's breath away. She gave a trembling smile, a goodbye he wouldn't understand, and stepped out into the rain that had begun to fall, mingling with the tears she could no longer hold back. As the door closed, Arthur heard a final click, a sound of closure, but instead of relief, a hollow, heavy feeling settled in his chest. He had protected his legacy, his son, from a supposed danger, so why did he feel like he had just lost the most valuable thing in the world? The days that followed were proof that the estate was no longer a home, but a sumptuous tomb. The silence returned, thicker and more oppressive than ever. The ghost of Leo's laughter haunted the halls. The boy stopped eating completely. He would sit at the table, his gaze vacant, pushing food around with a fork, the same food Beatrice now tried, in vain, to turn into a game. But the magic wasn't in the game. It was in the one playing it. Helena's absence was a palpable presence, a void that neither Arthur's fortune nor Beatrice's discipline could fill. Arthur tried to deceive himself, telling himself it was an adjustment phase, that discipline would win. But at night, when work could no longer distract him, doubt gnawed at him. He would find himself staring out at the garden, half expecting to see her sitting on the grass. He would pass the kitchen and could almost smell the vegetable broth she had made. The house was clean, orderly, but soulless. One night, a violent storm lashed the city, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Unable to sleep, Arthur went to Leo's room. The boy was awake, staring at the window where lightning tore across the dark sky. He wasn't crying, but his small body was tense with fear. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed, not knowing what to say. He tried the comforting words he'd read in books, but they sounded false and hollow. It was then that his gaze fell upon the small nightstand. Under a book, a corner of paper was sticking out. Curious, he pulled it out. It was the drawing, the three stick figures holding hands. Daddy, Leo, Mommy. Next to the figure representing his mother, Leo had scribbled another with long hair and a smile, and connected her to the group with a red crayon line. He had added her to the family. Arthur stared at the drawing, at the simple, powerful representation of the connection he himself had destroyed. The paper trembled in his hands. A wave of regret and pain hit him with the force of a tidal wave, shattering all his defenses. And there, in the dim light of the room, to the sound of the storm, Arthur Blackwood, the billionaire of steel, bent over the small drawing and wept. A convulsive, long-suppressed cry for the wife he had lost, for the son he was losing, and for the one person who had managed to bring light back into their lives, and whom he, in his cowardice and pride, had cast out into the darkness. The storm outside abated with the dawn, but the tempest in Arthur Blackwood's chest was just beginning. He hadn't slept. He spent the night awake, Leo's drawing in his hands, the image of the four figures joined by the red line seared into his mind. For the first time in years, he didn't think about interest rates, dividends, or stock prices on the Tokyo Exchange. He thought of the melody Helena hummed, the light in his son's eyes, the warmth of a simple vegetable broth. And he realized, with overwhelming clarity, that while he had been dedicated to growing his net worth, his true wealth had been draining away, slipping through his fingers like fine sand. The billionaire woke up to the fact that he was emotionally destitute. When he came down for breakfast, the house greeted him with its impeccable order and its deathly silence. Beatrice was already up, overseeing the table setting with military precision. She wished him a good morning with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that now seemed grotesque and false to Arthur. He didn't answer. He just sat down, his gaze lost on the empty place where Leo should have been. "The boy refuses to come down," Beatrice informed him, her voice tinged with a poorly disguised irritation. "This rebellious phase will pass. One must be firm." In that moment, something in Arthur finally broke. Apathy gave way to a cold, controlled fury. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. "No, Beatrice," he said, his voice so low she had to lean in to hear. "It's not a phase. It's a consequence. It's the consequence of your order." He walked toward her, his eyes, once clouded with pain, now held chips of ice. "I've been thinking about the picture frame. It's curious. Helena was in the kitchen. Leo was in the living room. And you, where were you exactly when the glass broke?" Beatrice went pale. The question was direct, logical, the kind of question a businessman would ask when analyzing a system failure, and she didn't have a convincing answer. I was coming from the hallway. I heard the crash and—" "No," Arthur interrupted. "You screamed before I got there. You screamed as if you'd witnessed a murder, but you couldn't have seen anything from the hallway unless you were already there, waiting." The silence that followed was a confession. Beatrice's face crumbled, the mask of loyalty cracking to reveal the envy and malice beneath. She said nothing, and she didn't need to. Arthur had his answer. He didn't fire her, not yet. That would be too easy. Instead, he ignored her completely, as if she had ceased to exist. He went upstairs to Leo's room, where he found his son curled up on the bed, clutching the small wooden bird Helena had given him. Arthur said nothing. He just sat on the floor, as Helena had advised him. He took some building blocks and, in silence, began to build a tower. Leo watched him, wary. Minutes passed. Arthur's tower collapsed. He rebuilt it. It collapsed again. On the third try, a small hand reached out and placed a block on top of the tower, steadying it. It was a tiny gesture, but to Arthur, it was like the shifting of a continent. In that instant, he made his decision. It wasn't about business, about pride, or about what others would think. It was about his son's breath. He went down to his office, walking past Beatrice as if she were a piece of furniture, and picked up the phone. He called his head of personal security, a man accustomed to tracking competitors and running background checks for high-stakes financial deals. The order, however, was the most unusual one he had ever given. "Find her," Arthur said, his voice firm. "Her name is Helena. I don't have a last name, no address. She took care of my son. Use every resource, all of them. I want her back." 2 days passed. 2 days in which Arthur sat on the floor of Leo's room, building and rebuilding towers in silence. On the evening of the second day, his phone rang. It was the head of security. The voice on the other end was grim, almost apologetic. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry. We've searched every database, employment agencies, social security records, everything. There's nothing. It's like this woman doesn't exist. Her trail just goes cold. We have nowhere else to look." The call ended, but Arthur remained with the phone in his hand, the device cold against his skin. The silence that followed was deeper than any he had ever experienced in that house. It was the sound of absolute failure. The man who could trace a Bitcoin transaction across servers on different continents, whose name opened doors in the highest echelons of global business, couldn't find a single woman in his own city. His vast resources, his fortune that could move mountains, were useless. He looked around his office, at the performance charts of his investment funds, at the trophies celebrating his financial acumen. It all looked like junk, a collection of empty symbols of a power that was useless for what truly mattered. The information from his security chief was a dead end, a granite wall against which all his wealth and influence had shattered. That morning, he didn't sit on the floor of Leo's room. He acted. He descended the stairs with an icy determination and found Beatrice in the dining room, rearranging the silver cutlery with a meticulousness that now disgusted him. "Beatrice," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, "come to my office, now." The housekeeper, surprised by the direct order, followed him, perhaps expecting a new list of instructions. Arthur sat behind his imposing mahogany desk, the place where he felt most powerful, but which now seemed like a stage. He folded his hands on the desk. "Your services in this house are no longer required," Beatrice gasped, the color draining from her face. "Sir, but I've served your family for 20 years. I took care of Eleanor." "And you poisoned my home," he cut in, his voice still calm, but with a steel edge. "You lied to me, and worse, you used my son in your scheme. There will be no discussion. The head of security will escort you out. A generous severance package will be deposited into your account. Consider it final payment for your services and your silence." For Arthur, it was a transaction, the closing of a toxic liability on his personal balance sheet. Beatrice stared at him, hatred gleaming in her eyes, but she knew she had lost. She was an employee. He was the master of the empire. In less than an hour, she was gone. Beatrice's departure left the house even quieter, but the air felt cleaner, more breathable. Still, the central problem remained. Helena's trail was cold. Arthur felt adrift in an ocean of helplessness. That afternoon, he was in Leo's room, watching the boy hold the small wooden bird with an almost religious devotion. Then he heard it. A fragile, hesitant sound. Leo was trying to hum. It was just a few notes, off-key and broken, but Arthur recognized the melody instantly. It was Helena's lullaby. Arthur's heart gave a painful leap. It was an echo of lost happiness, a constant reminder of what he had thrown away. Later, back in his office, he paced back and forth, the phantom melody echoing in his head. He had used the wrong tools. He had approached the search for Helena like a business deal, a logistical problem for his team to solve. But Helena wasn't an asset to be located. She was a person, a soul. He needed to think like her. He needed to access the memories he had blocked out of pride. He closed his eyes, forcing himself back to the brief days she had been there. What did she say? What were the small details he had ignored? He remembered her calm, her smile, her simple, profound answers. "I don't have a method. I have a heart." And then, like a flash of light in the darkness, the image came to his mind, sharp and clear. It was one afternoon while he was watching Leo play with the wooden bird in the garden. Helena had smiled and mentioned in passing, with a naturalness that made it go unnoticed at the time, "A very kind craftsman makes these for me. An old man who has a workshop in the Petal district. He says each bird carries a good wish." And at that moment, the sentence she said next, a phrase he had barely registered, came back to him with the force of a revelation, a clue his security team could never find in a database. She had said, "He donates most of them to the kids at St. Clair's Community Center. Over there. It's where I..." She hadn't finished the sentence because Leo had called for her. But now, for Arthur, that fragment of conversation was the only thread of hope in the entire universe. The fragment of memory was the key that unlocked the cage of his helplessness. The Petal District, St. Clair's Community Centre. Arthur Blackwood didn't wait. He didn't delegate. For the first time in a long time, the action he took wasn't to acquire capital or close a deal, but to follow the fragile trail of a lullaby. He dismissed his driver, took the keys to one of his luxury cars, and drove himself, the GPS off, guided only by the name of the neighborhood that now represented his only beacon of hope. The transition was jarring. He left behind the wide, silent streets of his neighborhood, lined with high walls and security cameras, and plunged into a labyrinth of narrow, vibrant streets. The Petal District in Queens was an explosion of life and color. Small shops with colorful facades, the smell of fresh bread mixed with the perfume from the countless flower stalls that gave the area its name, the sound of children laughing and pop music drifting from open windows. It was a world that pulsed with a human energy his estate had long forgotten. Arthur, in his impeccable suit and imported car, was an anomaly, a foreign element in this ecosystem. People looked at him with curiosity, some with suspicion. He felt exposed, stripped of the armor of his wealth. He parked the car and continued on foot, the small wooden bird he had taken from Leo's room safe in his jacket pocket. He approached an elderly woman selling gerbera daisies. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sounding far too formal in this environment. "I'm looking for a craftsman, a man who makes wooden birds like this one." He showed her the toy. The woman examined it, then looked at Arthur's anxious face. "Oh, Mr. Jean, the man with the lucky birds," she said with a smile. "His workshop is at the end of that street, the little blue door next to the bakery." His heart pounding harder, Arthur thanked her and headed in the direction she'd pointed. Mr. Jean's workshop was tiny, a magical nook that smelled of freshly cut wood, varnish, and something else, something like patience. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with carved animals, music boxes, and dozens of birds identical to the one he held, each painted with unique care. An old man with white hair and a face lined with smile wrinkles looked up from his work. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his voice as smooth as the wood he was sanding. Arthur approached, feeling like a clumsy giant in the delicate space. I believe you made this," he said, placing the bird on the counter. "Mr. Jean picked it up, his calloused fingers handling it with familiarity. "Yes, I did. One of my favorites. Gave it to a kind-hearted young woman. Said it was for a sad little boy." Mr. Jean's gaze met Arthur's, and there was a wisdom in his eyes that saw past the expensive suit. "Are you the sad boy's father?" The direct, non-judgmental question disarmed Arthur. "Yes," he replied, his voice thick, "and I made a terrible mistake. I need to find her. Her name is Helena. Do you know where she is?" Mr. Jean studied Arthur's face for a long moment, gauging his sincerity. He saw the genuine pain and regret in the rich man's eyes. "Helena isn't a woman you find if she doesn't want to be found," he said slowly. "But her heart is never far from those who need help." He leaned over the counter. "She volunteers at St. Clair's Community Centre, 2 blocks from here. Helps care for the children who have nowhere to go during the day. She has a gift. Makes the children the world forgot smile again." He paused, his gaze growing more intense. "If you go looking for her, you go with an open heart. Your money is worthless in there." Arthur nodded, mute, gratitude and panic mingling inside him. He thanked the craftsman and practically ran out of the workshop, the community center. 2 blocks. She was close, so close. He got in his car, the engine purring to life, and drove the few hundred feet that separated him from the place that held the key to his family's redemption. The fear of what he would say and what he would hear a cold knot in his stomach. St. Clair's Community Centre lacked the grandeur of the Blackwood estate. It was a modest, 2-story building, the paint on its facade slightly faded by sun and rain. But unlike Arthur's house, the place was overflowing with life. even from inside the car. He could hear the muffled sound of children's laughter and the echo of cheerful music. For a moment, fear paralyzed him. What would he say? How could he justify his cruelty, his weakness? The man who commanded meetings with billionaires and feared no opponent in the business world felt small. A frightened boy at a schoolhouse door. The rain began to fall, first a fine drizzle, then growing heavier, beating against the car's windshield as if trying to wash away his hesitation. He couldn't stay there. Taking a deep breath, he got out of the car, the rain immediately soaking his expensive suit. He walked to the entrance but didn't go in. A large glass window, fogged by the rain, looked into one of the main rooms. He moved closer, wiping a patch of the glass with his sleeve, feeling like a spy, an intruder in the life he himself had thrown away. And then he saw her. The scene that unfolded before his eyes was like a punch to his gut, stealing his breath and the strength from his legs. Helena was sitting on the floor, in the center of a circle of children. Children of all ages, of diverse backgrounds, but with one thing in common, the rapt attention they paid her. She wasn't doing anything extraordinary. She had a bowl of soup in her lap and a spoon in her hand, and she was quietly singing the same melody he had heard Leo try to hum. It was the airplane song. With infinite patience, she offered a spoonful to a little girl who looked frightened, turning the act of eating into a dance, a moment of affection. Arthur's heart contracted with a pain so sharp he had to lean against the wall. He had fired this woman, accused her of the worst kind of negligence, and here she was, giving her gift to children who had nothing, doing exactly what she had done for his son, nourishing the soul before nourishing the body. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Nestled beside Helena, his head resting on her shoulder, eating from a small plate in his own lap, was Leo. It was him, his son. The boy he had left at home, safe in his room, had somehow run away. He had crossed the city, driven by a longing and a need that overcame every barrier, and had found his way back to the one person who made him feel safe. He didn't look sad or lost. He was radiant. He laughed when one of the other children made a face, ate with an appetite Arthur hadn't seen in weeks, and looked at Helena with an adoration and trust that was a knife in his father's chest. The ground seemed to disappear from under Arthur's feet. The truth hit him with the force of a runaway train. It wasn't Helena who needed them. It was they who needed her. Desperately, his son had risked everything, not for a toy or a whim, but for love. A love that he, with all his money, with all his legacy and power, had failed to give and had almost destroyed. The image of his son, happy and safe in the arms of the woman he had cast out, shattered the last barrier of his pride. The rain ran down his face, mixing with the tears that now flowed freely, hot and bitter. He wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't a magnate. He was just a father who had failed spectacularly. With a sob that tore through his throat, he moved away from the window, rounded the building, and stopped before the main entrance. He opened it, the chime of the bell above announcing his arrival, and stepped into Helena's sanctuary, drenched, broken, and for the first time, completely stripped of his arrogance. The sound of the bell caused the chatter and laughter in the room to fade. Heads turned. When Helena looked up and saw Arthur Blackwood standing in the entrance, the world seemed to stop spinning. He was soaking wet, his hair stuck to his forehead, his $1,000 suit wrinkled and stained by the rain. But it wasn't his appearance that shocked her. It was the expression on his face. The mask of power and control was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability, a pain so palpable it crossed the room and hit her in the chest. His eyes were red, not just from the rain, but from crying. He was a man undone. Leo saw him next. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of confusion. He dropped his plate and clung to Helena's arm, his small body tensing as if expecting an explosion of rage. All the children in the room fell silent, sensing the tension emanating from the man at the door. Arthur's gaze swept over them all but landed on Helena and Leo, the epicenter of his crumbled universe. Slowly, ignoring the curious stares, Arthur walked toward them. Each step seemed to require a monumental effort. He didn't stop in front of her, in a position of authority. Instead, when he reached the circle, he knelt on the worn linoleum floor, the expensive fabric of his pants soaking up the floor's dampness. He was on the same level as the children, on her level. Rain dripped from his hair onto the floor in small puddles. "Helena," he began, his voice hoarse, broken. He couldn't go on. The words were stuck in his throat, a knot of regret and shame. He turned to his son. "Leo," he whispered, "forgive me." The boy looked at him, his large eyes filled with a wisdom beyond his years. He didn't look scared, just sad. Helena, feeling the small body tremble beside her, placed a hand gently on Leo's back, a silent gesture of support. Arthur then turned his gaze back to Helena, and the words finally came, in a clumsy, painfully sincere torrent. "I was a fool, a coward. I listened to the wrong voices, the voice of pride, of fear, of what people would think. I was so afraid of feeling anything again, of losing control, that I chose to turn my home into a prison." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "I thought I was protecting you from me, from my pain, when in reality I was running from the very thing my son and I needed most. Love, connection, what you gave us. And I threw it all away for nothing." The tears streamed down his face again, unashamed. "I fired Beatrice. I know the truth. I know it was a setup. And I fell for it because it was easier than admitting that a woman with a good heart was more powerful than my entire fortune." He held out his hand, not to touch her, but as a gesture of supplication. "I didn't come here to ask for your job back. I came here to beg you to come back to us." Helena stared at him in silence, her heart a mixture of pain for the injustice she had suffered and compassion for the broken man before her. She saw the sincerity in every word, the agony in every tear. She saw a father who had finally understood the true meaning of wealth. And then, something wonderful happened. Leo, sensing the shift in the air, the sincerity in his father's plea, let go of Helena's arm. He moved slowly and, with a gesture that sealed the fate of all three, took his father's hand and Helena's hand and joined them. He held them together, his small fingers a bridge over the chasm that had separated them. Helena looked at their joined hands, then at Arthur's face, who watched her with desperate hope. A tender yet firm smile formed on her lips. She squeezed his hand, a current of warmth flowing between them. "I'll come back," she said, her voice clear and serene, echoing in the silent room. "But not to work. I'll come back to take care of you. All three of us. Together." The word "together" hung in the air, not as a promise of employment, but as the beginning of a family. And for the first time, Arthur Blackwood didn't feel like he was making an investment, but rather receiving the most valuable inheritance of his life. 6 months later, the Blackwood estate was unrecognizable, not in its structure, but in its soul. The oppressive silence had been banished, replaced by the constant sound of laughter that echoed through the once somber hallways. The smell of floor wax had been traded for the aroma of carrot cake baking in the oven, a simple recipe Helena had brought from her old life that had become Leo's favorite. The laminated schedules had been burned, and the days were now measured not in 15-minute intervals, but in moments of joy. Building a blanket fort in the living room, hunting for ladybugs in the rose garden, finger-painting sessions at the kitchen table, Arthur's great fortune, his investments and stocks, continued to grow silently in the outside world, but he paid them little mind. He had discovered that the greatest profit of his life came not from dividends or interest, but from the sound of his son's smile. Arthur was a transformed man. The expensive suits had been replaced by comfortable clothes, and his office, once his sanctuary of power, now gathered a fine layer of dust. He spent his afternoons on the floor, learning from Leo and Helena the art of doing nothing, of simply being present. He discovered he had a talent for making animal-shaped pancakes and that his singing voice, though off-key, was perfect for lullabies. He, who once saw people as assets or liabilities on his personal balance sheet, was now learning to read the emotions on his son's face, to understand the language of Helena's heart. He was building a new kind of legacy, one that couldn't be measured in dollars, but in memories and affection. Leo flourished in this atmosphere of love and security. The apathy had vanished completely, replaced by a vibrant curiosity and a contagious joy. He began to speak in full sentences, to tell imaginative stories, and to show a remarkable empathy, often offering Arthur a hug when he saw him with a thoughtful look. He was no longer the sad boy, he was just Leo, a sweet, sensitive child who taught the adults around him the true meaning of resilience. And Helena, she was the sun around which this new family orbited. No longer an employee, but the matriarch, the partner, the beating heart of their reborn home. She guided Arthur with patience, teaching him to navigate the world of feelings, and loved Leo with a tender ferocity that healed all wounds. The final proof of this transformation came during a simple dinner on a Tuesday night. There were no guests, no formalities, just the three of them, sitting at the kitchen table, sharing a meal they had prepared together. The warm light illuminated their faces as they talked about their day. Leo, after scraping his plate with an enthusiasm that still moved Arthur, set down his utensils and looked at them both, his almond-shaped eyes shining with a serene clarity. In his sweet voice, he said the words that were the synthesis of their entire journey. "I eat now because you stay with me." The simplicity of that declaration struck Arthur and Helena with a profound force. It was the purest truth. It wasn't about the food, but the presence. It wasn't about nourishing the body, but about the security of the soul. Arthur reached across the table and took Helena's hand, their fingers intertwining. In that touch, there was a silent promise, an acknowledgement that they had built something real, something unbreakable, from the ruins of their loneliness. Love, in its simplest, most genuine form, had healed what money and power could never even touch. The estate, once a mausoleum of material wealth, had finally become a home, warmed by the only inheritance that truly mattered, that of a heart learning to love again.